Hello and welcome back. In this second segment, what I want to talk about is definitions of class, the idea of what constitutes a class. What you'll see is that it's a term around which there is a lot of contestation, but I think we can find some elements that are shared and some elements that are central. The first point that I would like to offer is that class is a term that is used everywhere. It is central to social science, but there is basic contestation over what the term means, over what is a class and over how important class is in discussing society. And probably one of the biggest frames of difference has to do whether we think of class as being a narrowly defined economic phenomenon, whether it has to do with economic position, whether this is property, or if you want to put it in Marxist terms, position in relations of production, or whether it also has some other dimensions in the social and cultural fields that are equally important. This is the foundation of the debate between followers of Marx and followers of Weber's and class. A second point has to do with the question of whether class, which is a term that originates in and develops its importance in the 19th century, whether it's relevant in the contemporary societies in which we live, or are there other categories that have become more important than class? If perhaps it's an outdated concept. A further question has to do with whether class is re-emerging. That is, whether there was a period in which classes were moving closer toward community of interest or becoming more similar to one another, or other divisions have become more important, and whether it's re-emerged as a result of global economic crisis. Uh, What we can say about class, I've used here the term stratification, although stratification is a controversial term. What all definitions of class have in common is that it's about imposing categories, and they're categories that are related to socioeconomic status. That is to say, the position that people occupy or groups of people occupy in a system that is defined by differences of income, of property, of wealth, but also of social status and power and prestige. That is the ability to call upon honor and recognition. We can also talk about class as being defined by some other factors, including in many of the societies that are of interest to us, geographic region. We can ask the question whether there is a class difference that is understood as existing between urban and rural populations, for example. Now, in most modern and contemporary capitalist societies, we think of three main social classes as existing: upper, middle, and lower, with subdistinctions. There is lower, upper, lower, middle, upper, lower, and so on. What it has to do is ranking people along a scale according to how much they earn, according to occupations, according to prestige, and so on. Now, this is probably the most frequently used application of class. There are some problems with it. Uh, One of them has to do with the question of whether we think of class as a noun or a verb. That is it a category of analysis, something that we look at from outside and say, here is a group that is in this class, here is a group that is in another, and draw some comparisons? Or is it a category of practice, that is a field of identity and a source of interest for people occupying a particular class position? A second problem is that we can talk about class as being ascribed, in the same way that some categories like ethnicity, religion, and so on are often inscribed on people's identities as birth, as class and identity. Or is class something that a person moves between based on activity, a status that a person occupies because of their current activity or current occupation? Now, one way of attempting to resolve this is by talking about class as being defined by what people do day to day. And this has been one of the contributions to operationalizing class that has been useful. It was asked by the sociologist Eric Olin Wright in trying to define who is working class, who is middle class, and so on. He asked, how much control do people exercise over their working time? If they are able to control their own time and their own activity to a greater extent, this puts them in a higher class position. If other people control their time, then they're in a working class position. According to the findings based on this, Eric Olin Wright concludes that most people have a different perception of their class position than what they believe they have in their responses to surveys. In most surveys in contemporary capitalist societies, around 70 to 80% of people will define themselves as being middle class. If you ask the question, how much control do people exercise over their time, then it turns out that actually 70 to 80% of people are working class. Now, this is complex. There's one way of resolving it, and here is a suggestion that's made by another sociologist, Don Kolb. I won't read out this whole quotation to you. You're able to read it yourselves. But I think I want to bring out a few key elements. That one is that class relates to structural social divisions. That is to say, that these are not superficial divisions. They are ones that define the basic outlines of life in the society, and that they have influence on a number of other factors: behavior, culture, political affiliation, and so on. And finally, that the dimension that in the end distinguishes one class from another is in the final analysis going to be property. That is, the degree to which people are able to exercise control over the goods that influence their position and that influence the degree to which they're able to call upon autonomy or honor or other factors. One way of understanding distinctions among definitions of class is that we could talk about class as a noun, or we could talk about class as an adjective. Now, what does this mean? As a noun, class takes on some objective, empirical qualities. You can ask somebody, what class do you think that you are in? They will give an answer, and it will be an answer that will be recognizable according to the ways that classes are usually differentiated. As an adjective, we can talk about class as a factor that modifies a whole lot of different things: class relations, class structure, class culture, class interest, class consciousness, and so on. That is, the idea here is that what is important about class is not its objective status, but the way in which it influences a number of other factors. People who think class is very important would say all other factors in social life. Now, how do we work our way through these distinctions and make decisions among them? In the next segment of the video, I want to talk first about some fundamental debates over the definition of class. It's structured by the difference between Marx and Weber, and then we'll move on to some more contemporary interpretations.